Have you ever worked on a project where you have lots of scripts to work with? When everything is piling up and is messy and you've gone completely insane? Well, this video is not a solution to those problems, but it definitely does make your mess look a lot more pretty and manageable. Today we will travel through namespaces. Shout out to Abdul Kader for suggesting this video. By the way, thank you to each and every one of you for supporting this channel. It really means a lot. So, namespaces. What are they? If you have worked on C Sharp, you may have noticed that namespaces are used a lot. Because I work a lot in Unity, I will be using Unity for demonstration purposes. But things remain the same everywhere else. When you create scripts in Unity, over at the top, you'll see a set of using statements. These statements are used to include these things called namespaces. Well, what are they? Namespaces, in simple terms, is a block that contains various code elements that could exist throughout multiple scripts. These code elements could include anything from classes, structs, interfaces, and even other namespaces. So you write a namespace like this. First, you write the keyword namespace, and then you actually give it a name. Let's call this my game for now. Take a note of the naming convention. The first letter is best to be capitalized. And we follow it with a couple of parentheses. Quick tip, Visual Studio gives blueprints for the namespace. So you can write name and then select namespace and hit tab twice. This is just an easy way to do it. And now inside these parentheses, we write our code. So whenever we create a new script, we are going to cut our class and then paste the class back inside the namespace. And now when we create another script, you can see that we cannot access the class that we have already created. In order to access any code elements in a separate namespace, we need to use that namespace. So in the top, we say using my game, and voila, we can now access anything inside that particular namespace. We can also use the dot operator to delimit namespaces. We can sort of create boundaries within namespaces like mygame.characters, and all the code for characters would go in that namespace and not on the original namespace. You can create as many namespaces as you want. Before we go in depth into namespaces, let's look at why they're important. Let me be honest, if you're a solo developer, you can get away without even using namespaces at all. But if you're working in a team, especially with multiple programmers, these are really handy. Even if you're working solo, this video would still be useful. One of the reasons why namespaces are important is that it really organizes our code. It can be used to separate blocks of our code into meaningful libraries based on how well they are related. So for the characters in our game, like the player and the enemy, we can put them into a namespace called mygame.characters. The code for movement and jumping can be put into a namespace called mygame.mechanics, and classes like health can be put into a namespace called mygame.core. It's like separating books into different bookshelves based on their genre. The second reason that makes namespaces really helpful is the fact that they eliminate naming conflicts. This may occur when you have multiple programmers. Let's say you have a player that has a component called movement, which uses arrow keys to move. And now an evil programmer comes along and creates a new component with the same name movement for an enemy, which perhaps uses the nav mesh navigation. Both of these code perform different things, but they have classes of the same name. This is going to be a big problem because while you're working in a team, you're going to have some sort of version control. The best way to fix this is effective communication with team members. You can also rename your classes, but man, it could really cause a lot of confusion, especially when you have version control. But a simple fix to all these problems would be using namespaces. We can put the enemy movement class inside a namespace called mygame.ai, and the player code into mygame.characters. And we can use the respective namespaces to access the classes. This is really useful while working on a larger project with a team. Now let's go a little bit in depth, a little bit more advanced reason of why namespaces are useful. So if you consider yourself a beginner to programming or to Unity, stop watching this video. What I'm about to tell you may be a bit too much for you to practice at the moment. Better stick to the basics for now, because you can get away without even using namespaces at all. But if you do know your way around your code and wants to, up your game, this is gonna be of value. What I'm about to tell you is something that I've learned from my experience. Perhaps it's bad. So, one of the things that you can do to improve the way you think while coding is by using the concept of namespaces to think ahead for the future and force yourselves to introduce decoupling. Now, it may sound weird, it may not even make sense, but hear me out. If you want to challenge yourselves to become better at coding, try to think of whatever you're coding as modular chunks. Modular, something that is a part of a whole, something that can just stand by itself without really depending on a bunch of other things that do not make sense with it. For example, let's say you're making the player, we have movement, physics, interactions, the health, the mechanics, but everything is put in one single script. Not only does that make the script too populated, but they make things easy, and things are dependent on one another when they don't really work together. Of course, this is completely doable and it's totally okay to do. But if you want to get better at coding, I want you to think of it in a different way. Imagine the human body. What does the digestive system have to do with a kidney? Nothing. But if you put them in the same script, then the script which contains code for digestion would also contain code about how kidneys work when they are not even working together at all. Like, it does not make sense together. Therefore, if we decouple it into its own individual systems or modular chunk, things really get separated and they function exactly the same. For a video game example, you can have a player script with, let's say, movement and health. And when you really think about it, health and movement has nothing to do with one another. They are just parts that make a whole. So put them in separate scripts. Now, the place where namespaces becomes useful is when you start creating these scripts and you can plan ahead of time what you're going to do. So when we create our movement script, we are immediately going to put it inside a namespace called mygame.characters, because the script is only for characters in my game. Easy. Now for a new script called health, we are going to take our time and think about it. The concept of health is often shared between various objects. It is not just specific to characters. Let's say a box could have health, the projectiles may have health, the UI would be dependent on health. Unlike movement, which is specific to characters, health could be used in many different objects. Therefore, we can put the class health inside a namespace called mygame.core or something like that. Now, whenever we are going to create new scripts or features, we will try to take some time to think about dependencies. And we want to create this script into a modular chunk. So with this approach, we think about things in the long run. So movement, which is a part of characters, have nothing to do with health, which is a core feature. If we single out namespaces alone, we would be able to make logical decisions, at least better decisions. Another big advantage of this approach is that you can now export these scripts into packages and reuse them in all your projects. And if you don't need one feature, you can easily just get rid of it. And because they're not dependent on one another, you won't face any problems. Here's a useful time saving tip. Once you get the practice of creating and using namespaces, every time you create a new project or work in a team, I recommend going to Edit project settings, editor, and here you can set a default root namespace. I recommend setting this to something generic like the term platformer or RPG because you may not have to change this if you are importing these namespaces into another project. For this video, I'm just going to use my game. Now all new scripts that we create will be assigned to the root namespace and we can delimit it as we like. So what if we need some sort of dependency? For example, let's say if we have a collectible and on collection it would damage the player if they move for 5 seconds or something like that. This has the need to access both health and movement. In this case, we can introduce an in-between class. Let's call it the effector because it affects the properties of the game object that it is attached to. Now, on collect, the collectible can access the effector based on the type of collectible, of course, and the effector will have access to both health and movement. And I think it makes sense to put it inside the namespace mygame.core, and it does what it needs to do. So you can see how just introducing the concept of adding namespaces early on could completely change the way you approach problem solving in coding. And to be honest, when you start, you're going to have absolutely no idea what you're doing. And it's okay, it's part of the process. It's going to be worth it. Also, it's going to be fun to do if you're up for a challenge. Cool. Since we just talked about collectibles, you can look at this video on how we can create a modular collectible system using the concept of inheritance. And adding namespaces and an in-between effector class, which we learned in this video on top of this, would definitely be game breaking. Take it up as a challenge if you can, and happy coding. Take care, see ya, bye bye. Thank you so much for watching this video. I have no idea why I'm doing that.